Hi again, everyone. It's Kevin Annett reading more from my book, The Border, just out in April 2019. You can get it on Amazon or just go to murderbydecree.com. The excerpt I want to read today is very important because it answers a question that many people may have, hopefully many people have, of how did this cover-up of genocide by church and state in Canada happen so successfully? The facts of the genocide that we brought out over many years have been so buried and shoved down the memory hole, as George Orwell would say, that people don't even recall these things. But it all began with one incident in April 1996, a secret deal made between Native chiefs and the United Church, who were the first target of lawsuits that yours truly helped bring about. So let me read this because it gives some important background. It's from chapter 2 of my book, The Border. Great Moments in the History of White People in Canada, Part 1. Or How the Fix Began, Sweeping Up the Little Bones. Sunday, April 14th, 1996, Port Alberni, British Columbia. With a foresight unusual for United Church of Canada bureaucrats, Marion Best and Virginia Coleman of the United Church General Council Office convene a secret meeting with top officials of the West Coast New Chelmsford Tribal Council, or NTC. The Tribal Council have recently commenced the first major class action lawsuits against the United Church for the crimes committed against children by its employees in the Alberni Indian Residential School, just 2 miles down the road from where I was a minister. Marion and Virginia have brought along their checkbook. This confidential conclave is not without a touch of irony, for it takes place at St. Andrew's United Church, the former clerical abode of the Reverend Kevin D. Annett, who was recently fired without cause and now faces defrocking by the same top church officers after he imprudently began asking questions about stolen native land and missing brown children. Unfortunately for the oblivious duo of Marion Best and Virginia Coleman, one of Kevin's associates and friends, the Reverend Bruce Gunn, is present that night at the secret meeting with the West Coast chiefs. Like the proverbial fly on the wall or snake in the grass, depending on your viewpoint, Bruce Gunn later gives to the sadder but wiser Reverend Annett a blow-by-blow account of what transpired at that historic gathering. The buck that evening stops with Virginia Coleman, who as General Secretary of the United Church of Canada brandishes an offer she is sure the chubby NTC chieftains will not refuse. In her words, quote, "The United Church is willing to provide some monetary compensation to a limited number of former Indian residential school students, but there are two conditions to our offer." One can assume that at this point, visions of something more than sugar plums are dancing in the heads of the native chiefs who are present. After all, these chiefs learned the score while children themselves in the local United Church death camp called the Alberni Indian Residential School, where over half the children never came back. Virginia Coleman continues, "The first condition is that you must agree to restrict your litigation to issues of personal injury and not matters of a criminal nature, such as the alleged killing of students. And the second condition is that you must disassociate yourselves from Kevin Annett and from his claims of murder in the Alberni Residential School." Our faithful observer Bruce Gunn was surprised by the speed with which the august body of Aboriginal leaders gobbled up the deal on the terms of the malefactor. Nelson Keatla, Cliff Atleo, and all the other NTC brass who were present that evening swallowed what was offered to them as dutifully as if it was the mush and maggots they used to eat in the residential school, but not before demanding an added sweetener in the form of considerable benefits that would accrue to themselves as part of this backroom agreement. Not surprisingly, there was a general atmosphere of goodwill and reconciliation prevailing afterwards among the pale and brown-skinned aficionados who were present that night. That spirit, of course, did not extend to anyone outside the arrangement, especially to Kevin Annett, his family, or any of the thousands of residential school survivors who could now expect, at best, a few drops of blood money and a gag order. Those rare Canadians who wonder why no native politician has ever called for a criminal prosecution of the churches that killed over 60,000 of their own relatives should well remember that Port Alberni meeting of April 14, 1996. for that night's arrangement set the pattern for the subsequent concealment of genocide in Canada by the churches that did the killing and by their willing accomplices who call themselves First Nations leaders. Well, that said, I can't resist. I've got to read part 2 of Great Moments in the History of White People in Canada. Part 2 is entitled, It's All About the Real Estate, Mate, What They Didn't Teach You in Sunday School. And we begin with three quotes actually. The first from John Ross, the original Presbyterian missionary and land speculator on that land of the Housets on the West Coast, October 1903. I have secured the land and arrested the pagans. He had the power to do that because he was not only a missionary, but the colonial government gave him the power of a magistrate and a police officer. He could arrest any Indian he wanted. The Presbyterians went on to found the United Church in 1925, which was also set up by the government of Canada, but that's another story. John Kishore, British Columbia NDP Environment Minister and United Church clergyman. We can't have Kevin upset the apple cart over the Howsett land deal. He said that just before my firing for bringing out the facts of that land deal, which you're about to hear about. And finally, Ujjal Dosanjh, the cabinet colleague of John Kishore and BC Attorney General in 1997. I regret to inform you that the internal disciplinary procedures of the United Church fall outside the jurisdiction of my department. I cannot intervene in the Church's actions against Reverend Annett. So in other words, the United Church is outside the law of Canada. And finally, the Provincial Conflict of Interest Commissioner, Mr. H.A.D. Oliver, to Kevin Annett, myself, in June 1997. Oh, come on now, Kevin. You don't really believe there's a separation of church and state in this country, do you? A decade after he learned to fear me, John Kishore was the first one to congratulate me on my maiden sermon at Vancouver's First United Church, where he was the pastor when I first preached there in the fall of 1986. If all your sermons are that good, Kevin, you'll have an outstanding career in the United Church, John effused ironically as he pumped my hand. The guy lived to regret his remark after he became a government minister. As for me, my anticipated career as a professional God-talker never came off, although I did learn how to give dirty politicians like John Kishore many sleepless nights. John's particular insomnia was caused during the hot summer of 1994, when I discovered a lucrative insider's deal that he had cooked up. Kishore used his position as an NDP cabinet minister to profit the government's corporate partner Weyerhaeuser Limited. It's the biggest logging company in the world. The deal profited the BC government's partner Weyerhaeuser while protecting John Kishore's own United Church of Canada from a potentially disastrous public scandal. It was all about old-growth cedar trees and the children's remains that they concealed and still conceal. In 1903, a man very much like John Kishore had arrived on the stormy coast of Vancouver Island on the ancestral homeland of the Ahousaht natives. The man's name was John Ross. As a Presbyterian missionary, he was given by the Crown the power of a cop, a judge, and an Indian agent. In this multiple authority, Ross set up what became the United Church's Ahousaht Indian Residential School, where over half the children died. The zealous John Ross systematically arrested any Ahousaht who wouldn't incarcerate their children in the death trap called a school. And in the process, he stole a big chunk of the Ahousaht people's land. John's multiple role as priest, child trafficker, land grabber, and magistrate wasn't all that unusual when one considers that his Presbyterian Church and its descendant, the United Church of Canada, were given huge swaths of land, indigenous land, by the British Crown. The same churches were also conferred with the legal power of a bank and a land broker, and were placed outside the jurisdiction of Canadian courts, along with the Catholics and the Anglicans. After all, how else do civilized Christians ensure that all those lucrative forests and fishing grounds end up in this right pale hands? John Ross was an efficient multitasker. Within a few weeks of his arrival, the Ahousats had been corralled into church and residential school, and the traditional chiefs were locked up by Ross and his band of Indian constables. Not coincidentally, the richest Ahousaht land and its old-growth cedar trees were also brought into the fold of what became the United Church of Canada, which the Canadian Parliament formed in 1925, interestingly enough. Fortunately for posterity, but unfortunately for John Ross, he was forced to hurriedly leave town early one spring day in 1909, when he was implicated in the death of a child at the residential school. The dead child was one Carrie George, age 8, who happened to be the only daughter of his chief adversary, the traditional CM or elder, McQuina George. Ross had threatened George that his children would never live to see adulthood. And in fact, Carrie didn't. Well, John Ross's legacy continued. In 1952, the United Church began selling off this stolen housed land to their financial backers, including their biggest financial donor, the logging company Macmillan Bloedel. And in 1994, Mac Blow signed away the housed land to the biggest lumber multinational in the world, the Seattle-based Weyerhaeuser, which eventually bought up Macmillan Bloedel in the biggest corporate acquisition in British Columbia history. And my old fan John Kishore secretly set up the whole deal thanks to his government office and achieves the cool $2 billion for everyone involved. Well, naturally, the houses never got a penny from this insider's deal. And besides lining the usual pockets, the deal carefully shielded the United Church's bloody history and land grab from public scrutiny. End of story? Far from it. Enter yours truly. I stumbled my way into the whole sordid mess in October of 1994 after being a minister in Port Alberni for over 2 years, and after I had learned about it from one of Chief McQuina's descendants, Earl George, who was an housed elder who often came to my Alberni United Church. Now wait just a darn minute, I exclaimed in a stunningly naive letter I wrote to my United Church bosses in Toronto after I got the complete description from Earl about the deal, including how the church had made megabucks off this a housed arrangement. I quoted United Church policy. I said, we're not supposed to profit off stolen native land. We're supposed to return it to the native nation and without charge. It says so right in our church policy manual, and I quoted that manual. The gullibility of youth. John Kishore's personal role in tossing me from my pulpit and destroying my livelihood and my family surfaced in the years following my rapid and unceremonious cashiering out of the United Church of Canada. As all co-conspirators tend to do under pressure, one of the Presbytery Church officers who'd arranged my firing, a guy called Win Stokes, spilled the beans at the United Church Kangaroo Court delisting trial in 1996 that robbed me of my profession and livelihood. Under cross-examination and in an obvious effort to cover his own ass and shift the blame, Win Stokes blurted out that John Kishore had insisted on my expulsion from the church after saying to Stokes, quote, "We can't have Annette upset the apple cart over the housed land deal," unquote. Stokes admitted that Kishore had also made sure that a housed elder, Earl George, never completed his approved training for United Church ministry by having his funding from both the local tribal council and the church presbytery cancelled. So in other words, Earl George and myself, the two public critics of the housed land deal, were both thrown out of the church in the same period of time by the same people. Well, that's business as usual in the Great Wide North, but none of it sat right with me, having still not fully awoken to the way things are. And so soon after my expulsion from the church, I had indignantly sought out one H.A.D. Oliver, a retired provincial court judge who had recently been given the misnomer, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner for the province of BC. His job was to investigate so-called conflicts of interest by BC politicians. Well, with an earnestness that can only come to the blindfolded, I wrote to Mr. Oliver to provide him proof that John Kishore had used his public office to profit and protect his associates in both Weyerhaeuser, Macmillan Bloedel, and the United Church. Well, I should have guessed what the obese Mr. Oliver would say the moment I was ushered into his Jabba the Hutt-like presence in a Vancouver boardroom. Mr. Oliver listened with an amused smirk on his face as I laid out the facts to him. His lordship only interrupted me once, to comment wryly that he too was a United Church member. But seeing that I still didn't get it, Oliver sat back after I was done, and he said to me with a typical insider's grin, "Oh, come now, Kevin, you don't really believe there's a separation of church and state in this country, do you?" Well, there you have it. And that was that. As for the housed people, no, they never got their land back, and most of them never saw a penny of all of the mega profits squeezed out of those legions of slaughtered cedar trees. But the same could not be said for their own compliant, government-funded chiefs, guys like Cliff Atleo, father of the future Assembly of First Nations Grand Chief, Sean Tonto Atleo, who made a bundle through setting up his own logging company called Lissac Limited, that's still the only company on the West Coast that is destroying the last of the old-growth red cedars. That's native care of the land operating for you. Well, it's funny about John Kishore because he's still around, but I hear that he turns an extremely apoplectic color whenever my name is mentioned. Well, hell, John, that's the price of civilization. I'm Kevin Annett, reading from the border, murderbydecree.com. Thank you.